Hello, my fellow forgiven sinners, and welcome back to our study on the Catechism. Today we're going through the fourth commandment. In our study so far, we've looked at the first table of the law, which primarily talks to us about what it means to serve God, what it means to have a right relationship with God. And one of the huge realities that we're forced to contend with in that first table of the law, in those first three commandments, is the fact that you are not God, and neither am I. And as sinful human beings, this is a really hard thing for us to grasp. We love the idea that we are the ultimate authority, that we get to finally call the shots. We ultimately get to say what is right and wrong. We are the ones who are ultimately in control of everything. But any wise person is going to recognize we have very little control in the world. As much as we might like to dictate to God how his world, how his universe ought to function, as much as we might like to call the shots in this relationship with God, as much of our prayer life revolves around us telling God what he should do, the reality is we aren't in control in here, right? We don't have the ultimate authority. Far from God being responsible to us, we are responsible to God. And therefore, we need to hear what he has to say rather than demanding that he hear what we have to say. Again, this is a sobering reality. It's a difficult thing for us to grasp. It's something that we really have to wrestle with our entire lives. Here in the fourth commandment now, we get sort of a bridge between this reality of ourselves not being God and us having to acknowledge somebody else as God, to now how we love our neighbor in this second table of the law. And the bridge is this fact that, okay, if we've gotten to the point where we can wrestle with this idea that we are responsible to someone else in God, right? We also have to contend with the reality that there are other creations of God that are also binding on us. There are other creations of God that have authority over us, that bind our wills, that force us to live this life in specific ways. And so some examples of those could be anything from other human beings that have authority over us and can force us to live our lives in certain ways, to simply the way that God has designed his world to function. So for example, gravity. Right? Gravity forces me to live my life in a specific way, right? Because gravity exists, I am not free to just jump off a building and expect to be able to fly, right? Instead, I have to operate within the way God has created his world, his universe to function. Once again, we see there's incredible wisdom here, right? This is, in fact, one of the reasons that science and medicine have been such a great blessing to us, because we are studying how God made his universe to function, and we're living according to that design. And again, we're going to find so much more blessing in our lives as we do live within these authorities that God has placed in our lives. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we dig into the fourth commandment. As we've been doing, we're going to start with Exodus chapter 20, where God first gives the commandments to the Israelites. There we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, honor your father and your mother, so that you may spend many days on the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Once again, we go to Luther in the Small Catechism. He writes it a little bit different wording here. He's grabbing from the New Testament, where the law is given to us again. And so here, the fourth commandment from Luther's Small Catechism, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not dishonor or anger our parents and others in authority, but honor, serve, and obey them, and give them love and respect. We've been talking about the gifts that our God gives to us in these commandments, the gifts that he gives to us and protects for us as we strive to keep these commandments. And notice the promise that is added to this commandment, right? God tells us that as we do abide by this commandment, that it's going to be good for us in the long run. We're going to have a long life in the world as we do recognize these authorities that God has placed over us. Once again, we see this reality that we already talked about, that when we do recognize how God's world is made to function, we're going to receive some benefit by living wisely, by living according to that design. And let me throw to you this idea that the gift that God is protecting for us in this commandment, this is going to sound really horrible to your ears if you're a good American, but let me throw this to you. The gift that God is giving us here is authority. Let's wrestle with that for a second. How can it be possible that one person having authority over another is a good thing? Think about that for a moment, right? Again, we love to complain about our leaders, our bosses, our parents, anyone else who might be able to tell us what to do. We have sayings like power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But here's the question, is that really true? Is it the power that corrupts the human, or is it the human that corrupts the power? Think about that for a moment. When you look at evil things in the world, evil that is done in the world, so many philosophers have pointed out that evil is almost always a corruption of something that is good. I remember listening to an apologist who said that if you take all the rust out of a truck, you've got a pretty good truck. But if you take all the truck out of the rust, you've got nothing, right? And this is exactly what we find with power. The problems that we see with people in power are so often an abuse of that power and authority that the person has. But the actual authority that they first have is a good thing at its core, at its heart. And the perfect example for how this idea of a master-servant relationship, a leader-follower relationship can be a good thing is found in the simple relationship of a father to a son. And this, in fact, is found in God himself. For example, Ephesians chapter 3 says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the entire family in heaven and on earth receives its name." The Apostle Paul is suggesting to us that all families really ultimately come from God himself. Now think about this, right? God chooses to reveal himself to us as three persons in one God, right? A Trinity. But within that Trinity, we have a father-son relationship. And in that relationship, there is authority, right? We see this continually. In fact, this is a really big thing for Christians to struggle with very often, that Jesus, throughout his ministry, is constantly submitting to the will of the Father. He says that he's not just doing whatever he wants, but instead his will is bound by another. He is forced in many ways to do what the Father says, and yet Jesus considers this to be a very good thing. He considers it to be very good for him to submit to the Father, even when submitting to the Father means going to his death on a cross. Now think about this relationship of a father to a son, right? I've got three kids, all very young still. But let's say, for example, I am radically devoted to freedom, okay? And so I take my 1-year-old son and I say, "Son, I am going to set you free." And so I put him outside our front door and I close the door behind him and I let him go and live his life. Total freedom. He can do whatever he wants now, right? What's going to happen there? Nothing good, right? My son is not going to do too well out there, only 1-year-old, right? Barely able to walk, and I'm probably going to get in trouble with social services, right? It's good, while my child is so young, it's good for him to be sort of enslaved to me as his father, right? And again, it is kind of a master-servant relationship here, right? Because he's not able to choose things for himself, right? He doesn't get to go wherever he pleases. He doesn't get to choose when he eats or even what he eats, right? He has very little decision in this whole relationship, and yet it's incredibly good for me as his father to have all of this power over him, all of this authority over him, because I am helping him to grow. I'm helping him to get to a point where someday he actually will have the power and authority to take control of his own life, right? But for the time being, it's good for us to have this power dynamic relationship. Because again, I am here as his father to do him good. And so this is really the core of how God has set up authority, how God has set up power from over one or between one person and another to function. It is meant to be this sort of father-son relationship. Any leader-follower, any master-servant relationship is meant to be this way, that one person has power over another to do them good. Again, going back to my relationship with my son, I get very little benefit out of this relationship, right? I have to work to make money to make sure that there's food on the table for my child. I have to make sure he's clothed. I have to make sure he's sheltered. I have to spend late nights up with him, helping him go back to sleep, right? I have to take care of him when he's sick, all these kinds of things, right? And he doesn't really have to put any effort in to make it work, right? He doesn't have to do anything, right? I get to hear him yell, I hate you, right? When I have to discipline him or whatever other thing, right? It can be a very thankless job at times. And yeah, he's cute at moments, but there are other moments where he can be an absolute monster. But it is good. Ultimately, it's good for both of us in this relationship. Because number one, me as the father, I get to join with God in experiencing real love, right? In not necessarily experiencing it, but in giving out real love, right? I'm able to do good for this other person who can't really ever repay me for all the good that I'm doing for him, and yet it is a very good thing. And he gets to receive all of that as he is under my power, under my authority. And so again, this is a very good relationship. It is not, authority is never set up in such a way that the authority is to abuse or force the other person in such a way that is only for the good of that leader and to the detriment of the follower. That is the abuse of authority. In fact, Jesus himself speaks about this in Matthew chapter 20, where he says, he's talking to his disciples, and they have been arguing with each other about which one of them is the greatest of all. And so Jesus says in Matthew 20, we read, Jesus summoned them and said, "You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It will not be that way among you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you will be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So think about what Jesus is telling us here, okay? Jesus is talking about, he mentions the nations, the Gentiles here, and he's talking about those who don't have God, okay? So how does the world function without the one true God? And Jesus says the way they function is this abuse of authority, right? People are trying to force their will onto other people for their own good and not for the good of those who are following, right? This is what we see all over the place. This is what we typically think of when we think about authority and power dynamics. But Jesus says this is not how it's designed to function. And especially within the church, among Christians, this is not how authority should work. Instead, Jesus points to himself as the perfect example of what authority is, right? We as Christians submit to Jesus Christ, but it's not a horrible thing, right? It's not horrible because Jesus is so good. He proves his love for us. In fact, he dies for our good, right? And so if this is what authority is, servant leadership. If this is what authority is, biblically speaking, it's what we see in Moses, right? As he's leading the Israelites through the desert, we read that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes to see how Moses is doing. And Moses is spending all of his day, he's running himself ragged, trying to decide and judge for the Israelites through legal problems and conflicts that they're all having. And he's practically going to kill himself because he's working so hard at this. And Jethro has to say, hey, you got to calm down and delegate some of this authority to somebody else so you don't kill yourself, right? But there, what is Moses doing, right? He's not sitting on the throne yelling, you go do this, you go serve me this, and you get all this stuff for me. Instead, he's practically killing himself, trying to do good for those that he is leading. Again, that's the kind of leadership that Jesus has over the church, and this is the kind of thing that authority is supposed to be in the Christian church. It is the leader killing himself, right? Giving himself, paying everything at every cost to do good for those who follow. And as those followers do submit themselves to that leader, they receive those benefits of what the leader is doing. Now, obviously, this gets a little complicated then when we talk about submitting to earthly authorities, right? Because those earthly authorities aren't generally going to be Christian. They aren't generally going to be in it only for the good of the followers. However, we also want to recognize the value of authority itself, of that core reality. And one final example, one final proof to you that, again, authority itself is at its core a good thing, is simply the reality that as you look through human history, I can't think of a single group of humans, I can't think of a single society that has not formed itself into some kind of authoritative structure, right? Because at its core, that authority is good. It helps society itself to move forward in a valuable, in a good way. And so having some kind of unity through that authority, some kind of security, some kind of assurance that the society can move forward in a collective way, there is benefit there, right? Obviously, there have been plenty of abuses, and we'll talk about that later a little bit. But at its core, again, authority itself is a good thing. So let's move forward and talk about how the Bible describes this authority within a family. In Ephesians chapter 5 and 6, we see a number of different power dynamic relationships within the family. And here we're going to get some ideas of how this, again, is playing out in God's mind, how God wants this to function. This certainly doesn't always happen in real life, and that's where, again, things get a little sticky and we have to work a little harder, have some forgiveness for each other. But this is how God wants a family to function. This first way is not very popular in our culture, but again, we want to recognize the ultimate value here that God is giving to us. So the first power dynamic relationship the Bible gives us within the family is husbands and wives. So let's read what the Bible says here. Ephesians chapter 5, starting at verse 22, we read, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he himself is the Savior. Moreover, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives in the same way as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, by cleansing her with the washing of water in connection with the word. He did this so that he could present her to himself as a glorious church, having no stain or wrinkle or any such thing, but so that she would be holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands have an obligation to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. To be sure, no one has ever hated his own body, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you also is to love his wife as himself, and each wife is to respect her husband." This is a fascinating section for me. Once again, we see this power dynamic, right? That the husband is to have authority over his wife, but once again, notice who the picture of authority is, right? It is Jesus Christ. So Jesus is not ordering his church around, sitting on the throne and doing nothing while his wife, the church, is out there scrubbing floors, right? No, Jesus is giving himself, dying for the church. And I can guarantee you, husbands, if you're willing to die for your wife, right? If you are giving yourself fully every single day at whatever cost, right? It's going to be a lot easier for them to respect you as you would want. Furthermore, really interesting thing here. This is a common problem that many relationships have today. Many husband and wife relationships have. I've read a lot of relationship books with my wife. We like to kind of do that to just work on our relationship, making sure it's growing, getting better rather than stagnating or getting worse. A very common theme that comes up in a lot of these relationship books that I've read is that men and women can sometimes see the world almost through different lenses. They can value different things, and that can lead to them only seeing the relationship through different lenses. Uh, it's very common for a woman to really want love from her husband in, for example, affectionate or physical touching ways, right? So a man, maybe not aware of this, and this is certainly something I fall into, but my wife really would appreciate displays of affection, like writing her a nice note, or even just touching the small of her back as I walk by, or something like that. That speaks affection to her. But I don't see the world that way. It's not on my radar. And so she has to actually tell me, hey, I would really appreciate if you do this, right? I feel good when you do this, and so please do these kinds of things, right? Do these displays of affection, right? It's valuable to her. She feels that love then. On the other side, though, men, again, not typically seeing the world that way, men will, again, this is generalities, right? Sometimes men do that. But men very typically operate on much more of a aspect of respect. And so, for example, you can see many wives that are, they make it very clear they do love their spouse, but sometimes they treat their spouse like a child, right? A classic example is the husband fills the dishwasher and then the wife comes in and she redoes it as if it wasn't good enough, as if he's not a human being that can handle filling the dishwasher, right? But you can see how a man can feel disrespected from something like that, right? A man could feel emasculated by something like that. But a woman, again, very often will not even notice that that was a problem, will not even notice that there was anything wrong with her doing that. And so it's fascinating to me that here the Bible gives us this idea of women, you really got to focus on respecting your husband, and man, you really got to focus on loving your wife, right? Again, these are not the natural ways that we look at life, look at relationships. Here the Bible, 2,000 years ago, is giving us this deep wisdom, right, that we're still figuring out today. Quite fascinating. Continuing on, Ephesians takes us to another family relationship with children and parents, or children and fathers specifically here. Ephesians 6 verse 1 starts, Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live a long life on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And so once again, we see this value that God has given to the family in this authority that he places over them. Parents, you have a responsibility to raise your kids right, to bring them up with wisdom and understanding. He specifically mentions the wisdom and instruction that we get from God himself in the Bible. And so again, when parents take that responsibility seriously, then kids get to grow up as wise, productive, valuable human beings, responsible adults, right? Children, on the other hand, right, as God has given you this incredible gift in parents, you're going to have a good time of it if you respect them, if you obey what they say, right? For example, if you're, say you're kind of in that rebellious teenager's point in your life, right, where you're questioning a lot of the things that your parents are saying, you're starting to learn, you're starting to get old enough that your parents don't have all the answers anymore, like you thought they did when you were a kid. If you're just a jerk to your parents all the time, right, if you make them being your parent an absolute misery, if you make that relationship such a burden, right, that's not going to be of any benefit to you, right? It's just going to make your parents angry at you all the time, right? It's not going to make them do their job in the right way or not even want to do their job in the right way. But if you work at being respectful, right? If you work at being a good child to your parents, right? If you work at respecting them and obeying them, again, they're going to like you more, right? Just naturally. And they're going to want to do their job even better. And so you can see how that's going to go much better for both you and your parents. There's a lot of value in recognizing, again, this authority God has placed in your life and living according to it. Let's go to the last example that the Bible gives us here. And we got to have a little disclaimer before we get into this section. Here he talks about slaves and masters. When we as Americans hear the word slave, we think of a very specific historical context for slaves. The picture we have is people who lived in Africa who were forced from their homes, taken to America, and then treated as property. This is not how slavery has always gone throughout human history. For example, the Jews themselves, God did allow slavery in their context, in their country, but it worked a very different way. Jews would, or the Israelites, when they were sold into slavery, it was generally by them selling themselves into slavery. This was a way of dealing with debt actually. So if I owed you a large amount of money and I just didn't have the money to pay it off, I wasn't going to be able to pay you off in any sort of reasonable time, I could sell myself to you as a slave and I could serve you for a specified amount of time. And then after that time, I would then go free again after I had paid off what I owed to you. And so again, this is a way that this is something that really isn't all that terribly different from how we still function today. Many people today still are functional slaves of the banks, right? That have mortgages on their homes or whatever other debt they might owe, right? They have to work to pay off all that money that they owe to somebody else. It's a kind of a similar situation. So here in Ephesians chapter 6, when we're talking about slaves and masters, probably a much better illustration for us or example for us today would be employers and employees, right? If you have a job somewhere, your boss here and you as the employee. This is kind of the dynamic that we're talking about here a little bit in Ephesians chapter 6. So let's look at what it says. Slaves, obey your human masters with respect and reverence and with a sincere heart, just as you obey Christ. Do this not just when they are watching, as if merely to please people, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Serve with eagerness, as for the Lord and not for people, because you know that each person, whether slave or free, will receive back from the Lord whatever good he has done. And masters, do the same for your slaves. Do not threaten them, because you know that the one who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and with him there is no favoritism. So notice how the Bible talks here, right? First off, to the employee, to the slave, right, the follower there, he encourages them to do their job well, right? And don't just do it to make your master happy, but do it as if you're serving God himself, right? Don't just work hard when your boss is there watching you, but always, right? Because ultimately, God is telling us you're serving God himself. And so do that faithfully. In the same way, he talks to bosses or masters here, and he says, "Hey, you got the same God as the people that are following you, right? You have to answer on Judgment Day to the same authority, right? And so treat this person that you're following or that you're leading in a valuable way, in the right way. Yeah, make sure you're doing that well." Going on from there, the Bible gives us a number of other authorities that branch out from the family. As we saw in the Bible, the way the Bible describes the authority within a family of parents over children, we saw that there is both a forcefulness there, right? The parent can force the family to do what needs to be done to make sure everybody is doing well, to make sure everybody is growing properly. And there also is a responsibility to parents to train their kids in the Word of God. However, when you grow up, your parents no longer have that authority over you, right? There is certainly still an authoritative relationship to some degrees, but your parents can no longer grab you, pick you up, and place you in places that they want you to go, right? You're too big now, right? But there is still authorities that have that kind of forceful authority over you. And there also are authorities that still help you grow in the Word of God. And so the first authority that the Bible gives us is the government, right? The government is this forceful authority that God has placed over us. The government has the sword. If you go around killing people, the government can force you to stop doing that, either by taking your life or by putting you in a room that you can't get out of for a while, right? And so this is the first authority that God gives to us just simply in the world. And again, it is good for us to have that authority. This is why we see, as we said before, pretty much every nation on earth, every society that has been put together by humans finds some kind of government to gather together under, because again, there is an essential goodness to that authority. As much as it might be abused in different ways. Here's how the Bible describes that in Romans chapter 13. Everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for no authority exists except by God, and the authorities that do exist have been established by God. Therefore, the one who rebels against the authority is opposing God's institution, and those who oppose will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to evil. Would you like to have no fear of the one in authority? Do what is good, and you will receive praise from him, because he is God's servant for your benefit. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because he does not carry the sword without reason. He is God's servant, a punisher, to bring wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For this reason, you also pay taxes, because the authorities are God's ministers, who are employed to do this very thing. Pay what you owe to all of them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. So once again, we see this reality that God has placed this authority over us. And one of the great blessings that we get from having an earthly authority is there's a certain amount of justice that is carried out in the world. As I said before, it stops evildoers from doing evil. Now, once again, this authority is often abused. This authority often does not carry out the justice that we would like to see. But there is a certain amount that is certainly done as we have this earthly authority placed over us. Now, a lot of people at this point will kind of bring up, well, hold on, what about if there's a government that's commanding you to do evil, right? We quickly point to horrible things like Hitler during World War II and things like that, right? What if you're placed under authority like that? The Bible gives us a number of examples of believers who were placed under ungodly governments that did command sin, command evil, right? We find the apostles who are commanded by the authorities to stop preaching Jesus Christ. We find some midwives who are commanded that when they help an Israelite woman to give birth, if it's a boy, they need to kill the baby right then and there, right? And those people disobeyed. We find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who are commanded to bow down and worship a statue. And if they refuse to, then they were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace, right? All of these examples make it very clear that when we are commanded to do something that is wrong, to do something that is evil, we must obey God rather than men. And so just because God has called us to submit to the earthly authorities, that doesn't give us a blank slate to ignore what we're actually doing. And just say, well, I was told to do this, and I got to do it as I'm told, right? No, you still have to take responsibility for your own actions, right? You do have to still make sure that you yourself are doing what is right. And there may be a case where, like the three men in the fiery furnace, right? The government tells you, we're going to kill you if you don't do this evil thing. And you have to, at that point, the way you submit to the authority is by saying, okay, I'm not going to do that, but I respect your power to kill me now, right? And as Christians, we need to learn to be okay with that, right? God has not told us that this world is always going to be sunshine and daisies, right? We are going to face persecution when we do what is right sometimes. And as Christians, we need to recognize that too is a good thing. We need to be willing to go through with that. Now, the scriptures also tell us that not only do we have earthly authorities over us, but God also places spiritual authorities over us, specifically in the church. And so a couple of examples of how that works out are given to us in 1 Peter chapter 5. There we read the first 5 verses and see how in the church there's a little bit of a different idea of how this authority works. Because in the church, again, hopefully, God willing, you actually do have Christians over you as your pastors and teachers there. And so there, those authorities are going to receive that command of you need to lead like Christ, right? Christ who didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is the kind of leadership that should be happening in the church. And so here we find some encouragement to leaders. In 1 Peter, where he's talking to elders, and the closest equivalent to a modern day elder would be basically just the clergy, right? Some kind of pastor or priest. And so here the Apostle Peter says, therefore, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and as one who also shares in the glory that is about to be revealed, I appeal to the elders among you. Shepherd God's flock that is among you, serving as overseers, not grudgingly, but willingly, as God desires, not because you are greedy for money, but because you are eager to do it. Do not lord it over those entrusted to your care, but be examples for the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive an unfading crown of glory. Likewise, young men, be submissive to those who are older, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Peter here reminds us that especially within the church, there is a huge temptation toward pride. And this cannot be the way that God's people conduct themselves, with this selfish puffing myself up as if I am so much smarter, I am so much better than everyone else. Instead, we should look to our church leaders as people who do have a greater understanding of the scriptures, people who can help us to grow in our understanding of God and in our relationship with him through Jesus Christ. And so it's good for us, again, to submit to these authorities that God places over us. But notice again, right? The overseer within the church is commanded to serve like Jesus, right? It's not for my own good, right? The pastor doesn't serve for his own benefit, but instead he serves for the good of his followers. And here's again an encouragement to those who submit to those leaders in the church. Hebrews chapter 13 says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as men who will give an account. Obey them, so that they may do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no benefit to you." Once again, we see this idea that when you submit to the authorities, it's to your benefit, and specifically too in the church, right? Within the church, pastors, one day, again, when we all stand before the same judge, God on the last day, pastors are responsible for their flocks, right? And they'll have to give an account there. And so again, it's valuable for us to make their leadership over us a joy for them, again, because that is for our benefit as they work for our good. Finally, to close out, we've seen a little bit how we as human beings struggle with this idea of authority. We often are complaining about authorities. We often are rebellious against those authorities God has placed over us. We don't respect them the way God wants us to. We can see how we fall short in recognizing how God has designed his world to function, and our selfish and foolish insistence that we're just going to make up how we want the world to function and try to live that way. But as we look at the life of Jesus, not only do we see a good example for us to follow, but we also see our perfect righteousness. We see Jesus perfectly fulfill this fourth commandment in our place. And so in Luke chapter 2, this is the account where Jesus, as a young boy, stays behind at the temple to study more of God's word, and his parents travel off thinking that he's with the family, and all of a sudden at night they realize he's not there and they freak out. But when they find him, right, we read these words. Jesus went down with them and came to Nazareth. He was always obedient to them, and his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. So here we find Jesus honoring his parents, these authorities that the Father had placed over him, right? And here he is doing that for us in our place. We also see, again, this distinction that Jesus gives us. In Matthew chapter 23, we read about this fascinating way that Jesus taught his disciples about the Pharisees and the experts in the law. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you know that Jesus is always butting heads with the Pharisees and the experts in the law. But notice what he says here. He said, "The experts in the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So practice and observe whatever they tell you, but do not do as they do, because they do not practice what they preach." Again, Jesus gives us this distinction of recognizing that we do have a responsibility to submit to authorities, but we also want to recognize when there is corruption going on there, right? And so if somebody has authority over me, again, it's good for me to submit myself to that authority, but at the same time, and it's good for me to also call them out when they are doing something evil, right? And make sure that I don't follow in their evil, right? And so Jesus here, again, is able to drive this line pretty well of recognizing authorities placed over us, submitting to them, but also recognizing good and evil and living accordingly. Finally, I just want an example of just before Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus is wrapped up under a very horrible authority, a very horrible government. He is taken at night, which was illegal, to a false mock court where false witnesses are lying about him, and yet we find Jesus submitting to that wicked authority. Why? So that he can die on the cross for your salvation. And so here we read, the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is this these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I place you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you have said. But I tell you, soon you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So here we have Jesus again, submitting even to this horribly wicked government, right? This horrible abuse of authority. But Jesus finds this balance where he is able to submit to that authority, suffer under that authority, and in so doing, he's able to do great good, infinite good, for you and for me. And this is the kind of righteousness that God sees when he looks at you as a Christian, right? He doesn't see the way you have been disobedient, the way you have been rebellious, the way you have foolishly tried to live in your own imaginary world instead of recognizing how God has designed his world to function. Instead, God sees you covered with the perfection of Jesus. He sees you as being perfectly obedient to the world, to the universe that he has designed, to the authorities that he has placed over you. And so this is how God looks at you and how he is proud of you. That's it for today. God's richest blessings on you until we meet again.
And I say, can't be that easy. And he said, and no, it wasn't easy. But be still and know that I am God. Be still and know